Have you ever found yourself repeating words without feeling, letting prayer time become a mere empty ritual? Often our search for communion with God is obscured by a hint of hypocrisy and the repetition of formulas, where the true spirit of prayer is lost between distractions. This reality brings us to Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees, who, with his ostentation, diverted sincerity and intimacy with God, demonstrating a faith devoid of the true spiritual reward. Imagine if, instead of staging a performance, every moment dedicated to prayer was an authentic moment of encounter with the divine, where faith revealed itself in gestures of perseverance and fasting, guiding us by God's will. It is possible to transform prayer time into a space of deep communion with God, abandoning the traps of vain repetition and hypocrisy. Inspired by the biblical examples of Anna and Hezekiah, we are invited to cultivate a real intimacy, where each word said is loaded with sincerity and hope. On this journey, we will unravel the two mistakes that can compromise the quality of our prayer and learn to avoid them so that we can enjoy a true connection with God. By recognizing these flaws, you will be better prepared to align your faith with the divine will, leaving behind distractions and behaviors of the modern Pharisees. Get ready to transform your moment of prayer into an enriching experience, full of the spirit of prayer and the spiritual reward that only a sincere communion with God can provide. Prayer is the essence that connects man to the divine, a sacred channel of communion with God that transcends simple formality. It reveals intimacy with God and God's will, allowing a genuine encounter with the Creator. Even in prayer time, where every word echoes faith and sincerity, it is easy to get lost between the distractions of everyday life. It is in this surrender environment that the spirit of prayer strengthens itself, paving the way for a true spiritual reward. However, prayer can be distorted when it becomes a mechanical ritual, marked by the repetition of vain without depth. Hypocrisy settles when trying to impress modern Pharisees, seeking human recognition rather than a real communion with God. Sincere practice requires every moment of prayer to be lived authentically, without masks or devices. Thus, it is vital to book a time of prayer that reflects perseverance and intimacy with God, free from distractions. Each time of prayer must be an opportunity to connect in a deep and personal way with the divine. Inspired by the biblical example of Anna and Hezekiah, we realize that a genuine prayer always transcends mere formalism. The practice of fasting, coupled with prayer, can renew our faith and approach the will of God in a surprising way. Therefore, to cultivate the spirit of prayer is to embrace true communion with God, leaving aside any trace of hypocrisy or vain repetition. When it comes to prayer, it is vital to recognize that hypocrisy has no time in true communion with God. Jesus warned about those who pray to display spirituality, imitating the Pharisees in search of human applause. The practice of prayer must be lived with sincerity, allowing each word to reflect a genuine intimacy with God. Instead of turning prayer time into a performance, we must cultivate an authentic connection, guided by faith in God's will. Unfortunately, many fall into the trap of vain repetition, transforming prayer into a mechanical act and full of distractions. This posture, marked by an empty ostentation, removes the spirit of prayer from its essence and purpose. It is necessary to abandon the practice of imitating the Pharisees, seeking, instead, a humble and sincere approach. True prayer reveals itself when we set aside the desire for recognition and focus on intimate communion with God. To correct this failure, it is inspiring to look at the biblical example of Anna and Hezekiah, who prayed with their hearts open and without artifice. Integrating practices such as fasting strengthens faith and deepens intimacy with God, driving away any trace of hypocrisy. By practicing an authentic prayer, we avoid the trap of vain repetition and allow the spiritual reward to manifest in a surprising way. Thus, by turning every moment of prayer into a sincere dialogue, we get closer to the true will of God and renew our spirit of prayer. In the practice of prayer, vain repetition can turn a sacred moment into a mechanical ritual. Jesus warned us about the danger of meaningless words used only by habit. When prayer becomes a mere act of recitation, it loses its strength of communion with God. Each time of prayer must be lived with sincerity, without distractions that overshadow the spirit of prayer. Hypocrisy reveals itself when it seeks to adorn faith with empty words, similar to the Pharisees. Just as the vain repetition can hide true intimacy with God, it deviates the focus of divine will. The genuine practice of prayer requires perseverance and sometimes fasting to renew the connection with the divine. Each word must reflect faith and sincere desire for communion, pushing all ostentation away. The biblical example of Hannah and Hezekiah shows us the power of a prayer made with an open heart. By avoiding vain repetition, prayer time turns into authentic conversation with God without devices. This practice strengthens intimacy with God, allowing spiritual reward to manifest in life. Therefore, always seek sincerity and depth in your prayer, embracing renewed faith and without distractions. In the journey of faith, prayer time is not restricted to isolated moments, but permeates every moment of life. Whether at work, at home, or at school, each situation is a chance to come into communion with God. By avoiding distractions and the repetition of mechanical habits, we find a space of genuine intimacy. This continuous practice removes hypocrisy and reaffirms faith, strengthening the spirit of prayer. The Bible teaches us that prayer is a state of mind, without being confined to a specific time. Every moment, either during a fast or daily routine, it becomes an opportunity to dialogue with God. When we set aside the desire for recognition and avoid behavior of the Pharisees, sincerity prevails. Thus, God's will manifests itself, transforming the time of prayer into an authentic conversation, full of faith and perseverance. Cultivating the habit of praying continuously is nourishing an intimate relationship with the divine. Inspired by the examples of Anna and Hezekiah, we realize that prayer adapts to the flow of life. Even in the face of daily distractions, it is possible to reserve moments of prayer that unite faith, perseverance, and the spirit of vibrant prayer. In this way, each moment becomes sacred, reflecting the spiritual reward of a genuine communion with God. Prayer must be an open and sincere conversation, where it does not resort to rehearsed words or vain repetition. By setting aside hypocrisy, we set a deep and natural connection with God, celebrating every moment of prayer time. This practice, free of devices, strengthens communion with God and allows faith to manifest with authenticity. Thus, we avoid behaviors that mimic the Pharisees, honoring God's true will with sincerity. A genuine prayer is that moment when the believer expresses his needs, gratitude, and personal challenges without reserve. By prioritizing sincerity, we remove distractions and vain repetition, cultivating real intimacy with God. Even in the midst of fasting or daily difficulties, each word said becomes an act of faith and perseverance. Thus, the spirit of prayer is enriched, promoting a spiritual reward that transforms the heart. Inspired by the biblical example of Anna and Hezekiah, we realize that an authentic prayer transcends empty rituals. Talking to God without artifices allows intimacy with Him to flourish, removing any sign of hypocrisy. Every moment of sincere prayer becomes an enriching dialogue that reaffirms our faith and brings us closer to the will of God. Thus, prayer consolidates itself as the vital link between human and divine being, eliminating vain repetition and distractions. On a journey of faith, the danger of the religious spectacle manifests itself when prayer turns into a show to the eyes of others. Many are carried away by hypocrisy, using prayer time to seek applause rather than cultivating true communion with God. Jesus, in criticizing the Pharisees, stressed that the repetition of words does not build intimacy, but distances the believer of the divine. Authenticity in prayer arises when we abandon the theater and embrace sincerity in every moment of faith. When religious practice becomes a spectacle, the essence of fasting and intimacy with God is lost in the midst of superficial distractions. The focus moves from the true spiritual reward to the search for human approval, creating a cycle of empty ostentation. Biblical examples, such as Hannah and Hezekiah, teach us that prayer must be a sincere act, no devices or vain repetition. Thus, It is vital to rediscover the true spirit of prayer, which transcends any performance and aligns with God's will. By setting aside the show, prayer becomes an intimate and genuine conversation, free from the pitfalls of hypocrisy. Each word dictates with sincerity, strengthens faith, and deepens communion with God, far from any exaggerated formalism. It is even possible to laugh at a little of this modern scam, understanding that the true time of prayer does not need stage. Cultivate authenticity, maintain perseverance, and allow the spirit of prayer to manifest in a natural and transformative way. Private prayer is a refuge where intimacy with God is strengthened without the distractions of the world. When we seek a time of prayer away from the eyes of others, we set aside the hypocrisy and the vain repetition. This silent moment allows to hear the voice of God's will and cultivate a genuine faith, free of formalism. Thus, communion with God deepens, revealing a spirit of renewed and sincere prayer. As we move away from the modern Pharisees who pray to impress, we find freedom in intimate prayer. In this reserved environment, each word reflects sincerity and true connection with God, without devices. The biblical example of Hannah and Hezekiah teaches us that private prayer is a fast for the soul, strengthening faith. This practice eliminates distractions, allowing spiritual reward to manifest with clarity and perseverance. Cultivating the habit of private prayer is an act of love that transcends the ritual, revealing the essence of intimacy with God. At every moment reserved, our feelings align with the divine will, transforming the repetition of sincere dialogue. The experience of prayer in secret renews faith and inspires a journey of perseverance, where each word is full of meaning. Thus, by valuing the power of private prayer, we reaffirm our communion with God and arouse an authentic spirit of prayer. Hannah teaches us that true prayer transcends rituals and vain repetition, revealing an intimate communion with God. In her prayer time, she broke with hypocrisy and rejected the empty gestures of the Pharisees. With sincerity and perseverance, Hannah cried to the Lord with an open heart without distractions. His unshakable faith and dedicated fasting were instruments that brought her closer to God's will and granted her a spiritual reward. Hezekiah, in the face of Assyrian threat, demonstrated a robust faith by surrendering to prayer with total sincerity. He rejected the vain repetition and ostentation, seeking in an intimate dialogue the divine orientation. During his prayer time, Hezekiah stood out for perseverance and genuine communion with God. His practice, free from distractions and hypocrisy, has become an inspiring example of intimacy with the divine. These biblical examples show that prayer should not be a mechanical act, but a sincere encounter with God. In integrating fasting and cultivating the spirit of prayer, our faith is renewed and aligns with divine will. Rejecting vain repetition and Pharisaic behaviors invites us to live in authentic communion with God. Thus, Hannah and Hezekiah inspire us to transform every moment of prayer into a deep and rewarding spiritual experience. Each prayer must be a sincere reflection of God's will, without hypocrisy or distractions that diminish the intensity of faith. In prayer time, we avoid repetition vain, allowing communion with God to manifest with total sincerity and intimacy. In following the biblical example of Hannah and Hezekiah, we align our prayers with divine purpose, transforming fasting and perseverance into instruments of transformation. Thus, the spirit of prayer strengthens when each word is carefully attuned to God's will. Aligning prayer with divine will means abandoning Pharisaic behaviors and ostentation, valuing authentic faith. Every moment of prayer becomes a deep dialogue, where sincerity prevails over vain repetition and everyday distractions. When intention turns to real communion with God, spiritual reward reveals itself, making prayer time a true sanctuary of intimacy with the divine. This practice invites us to cultivate a genuine faith, where fasting and perseverance joins the inspiring example of the ancient prophets. In dedicating every moment of prayer to align our desires with God's will, we reinforce the authenticity and essence of our dialogue with the Creator. Eliminating hypocrisy and avoiding vain repetition, we transform our prayer practice into a moment of focus and total delivery. Thus, each prayer becomes a living expression of faith, in which intimacy with God translates into a palpable and inspiring spiritual reward. True prayer, guided by divine will, invites us to live a journey of perseverance and sincere communion with the spirit of prayer. The time has come to turn every time of prayer into a genuine encounter with God, free from hypocrisy and vain repetition. Are we allowing Pharisaic distractions and behaviors to steal our intimacy with the divine? Reflect, how can your faith strengthen when aligning your fasting and perseverance with God's will? Each prayer, if done with sincerity, is an opportunity to receive the spiritual reward that comes from the spirit of prayer. Have you ever wondered if you are really eliminating ostentation and embracing communion with God in your prayer time? Inspired by the examples of Anna and Hezekiah, think about how to renew your faith through intimate and artifice-free practice. Is it time to reflect how much your sincerity has made a difference in your connection with the divine? Believe me, every act of prayer, if lived with dedication, pushes distractions and intensifies your intimacy with God. Now, the decision is yours. Are you ready to act and turn your moments of prayer into experiences that build your life? If so, subscribe to our channel and enable notifications to receive more content that inspires faith and true communion with God. That every question asked to the heart becomes a sincere practice, far from any vain repetition and hypocrisy. Let us together cultivate a journey of perseverance and spiritual reward, living the true essence of the spirit of prayer.